And on to our next speaker. It's my great pleasure to invite Professor Tommy Boland from my old alma mater, University College Dublin, onto the stage. So the notes that have been provided to me, Tommy is from the brave County Wexford, Lough Garman, on the east coast of Ireland, where men are men and sheep are nervous. And as Tommy is still a sheep farmer, he might be able to explain to you why the flock is nervous. Tommy's research interests are varied, but centre on sustainable pasture-based livestock production systems, which includes methane mitigation, reducing nitrogen loss, and diverse swards. He is currently president of the Agricultural Science Association in Ireland and is secretary of the Livestock Farming Systems Commission of the European Association of Animal Science. Welcome, Tommy. Diagrid.
Gorv míle maith Sean. Dígí a card galéir, tána hasarm, bheith lín an seo inniu. So thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here with you today. I'm not quite sure what to make of John's sheep reference, other than to say he did leave Ireland for one of the few countries in the world with a higher sheep population than Ireland, so maybe that tells its own story.
No nervous sheep.
So it's always a great pleasure and privilege to visit New Zealand, and I think it's important that I acknowledge on this visit the suffering and loss that has been incurred by your fellow citizens over the last month, but also just to recognise that right around the world, our global citizens are also experiencing that same loss on a daily basis, but it just brings it a little bit closer to the front of our minds when it happens closer to home. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Irish situation. I should probably tell John at this stage I have a very particular type of deafness, which means I can't hear that little bell he has on the table, so I may not stop if he rings it, but knowing John, he might throw it at me. So, right, let's kick off straight into this. So I've been asked to give a little bit of an overview of the Irish situation, and I'm going to start by talking a little bit about Irish agriculture. And you know, we talk quite a lot about Ireland and New Zealand being similar countries, and we are similar to a sense, but we're different as well. There are about 135,000 farmers in Ireland out of a population of about 5 million people. The average farm size is very small by New Zealand standards. So the average farm size is about 33 hectares. Okay, so it probably just comes under the heading of a lifestyle block in a New Zealand context. We've about 4.5 million hectares of agricultural land in Ireland, but that's predominantly dedicated to grazing and to livestock production systems. And again, that's very unusual by European standards, with only about 6 to 7% of the total agricultural area dedicated to cropping and horticulture. And there are various reasons which I can discuss later as to why that situation has occurred. We've heard a lot about agricultural emissions over the last day, but I think it's important to also highlight that not only does agriculture produce emissions, it also produces food. And in Ireland, we don't produce a lot of other goods. Our economy, our indigenous economy, is built around agriculture. We exported between 16 and 17 billion euros worth of food last year, so that's about 30 billion New Zealand dollars. And given the predominance of grassland in our production systems, those food exports are dominated by milk, by dairy products, by meat, which is predominantly dairy, and then by prepared foods, which have developed on from those animal products. So that's just the agriculture and the food side of things. To look at the sectoral breakdown of greenhouse gas emissions, and again, we're slightly unusual in a European context because our economy's greenhouse gas emissions are dominated by agriculture. We're slightly under 40% of Irish greenhouse gas emissions arising from agriculture. If we look at the following two largest contributors of greenhouse gas emissions, being transport and the energy industries, combined, their total doesn't reach that of agriculture. So it's a very particular concern which is exercising our scientists and our politicians and our policymakers to a great extent at the moment. If we delve a little bit deeper into those agricultural greenhouse gas emissions, and again, a picture which is quite familiar, I would suspect, for a New Zealand audience, our agricultural greenhouse gas emissions are dominated by enteric fermentation. So that accounts for almost 2/3 of our agricultural greenhouse gas emissions. Agricultural soils would rank number 2, which again is predominantly driven by animal excreta, either directly deposited or, given the fact we house our animals for relatively large periods of the year, the application of slurries and farmyard manures, and then some fertiliser application as well. And then we have manure management from the stored and storage of farmyard manures over the house period. If we look at the recent evolution of Irish agricultural emissions, it's been a bit up and down, a little bit like the earthquake I experienced in Palmerston North shortly into my stay in New Zealand. It's a bit wavy. So we had seen agricultural emissions decline from the late 1990s down to around 2010. Since then, we've seen a pretty persistent increase in Irish agricultural greenhouse gas emissions, and this has been largely driven by expansion of the dairy herd in Ireland. So we've more dairy cows now than we had 15 years ago, and there's more fertiliser and nitrogen applied to that land to grow the grass for dairy cows than there was 15 years ago as well. And again, there's some very clear policy reasons why that has occurred, particularly the removal of the milk quotas in the European Union. So the government in Ireland have recently agreed the Climate Action Plan, which has set out a cross-economy target for a 50% reduction in national greenhouse gas emissions. And then we have individual sectorial targets within that 50% reduction. Agriculture, as you can see, has agreed a 25% reduction target by 2030, and some of the other sectors have a greater than 50% reduction target, particularly electricity generation. And these targets were the result of a lot of consultation, a lot of lobbying, I suspect, and a lot of weeping and crying and gnashing of teeth, perhaps along the way too. But still, they generate a lot of discussion and perhaps a certain amount of dissatisfaction amongst the agricultural community. So, what happens if we do nothing? Okay, under a business as usual scenario, these are the projected agricultural emissions by 2030. Basically, if we do nothing, nothing happens. That's not terribly surprising. So unless there's some changes made or a business as usual scenario, we have the same level of emissions in 2030 as we have today. The red line looks at the projected agricultural emissions in Ireland with additional measures. So this is the application of existing near market ready and future technologies to deliver our 25% reduction target by 2030. So what are these technologies that can be applied in an Irish context? And I'm sure a number of them will apply across the New Zealand context as well to help deliver this reduction target. So what we're seeing here is the marginal abatement cost curve, which Gary Lanigan, and I'm sure many in the audience are familiar with Gary's work, and his colleagues in Teagasc have developed. Essentially, the columns in blue represent methane, and the columns in green represent nitrous oxide. So these are the various strategies that can be applied. If the column is below that line running across, I'm not sure if we have a pointer. Well, that was the wrong thing to do. If the columns are below that line running across the graph, there is a cost saving to implementing that particular technology. And if they're above the line, there is a financial cost to implementing that particular technology. And then the width of the bar represents how much mitigation the application of that particular technology can deliver. So we have the dairy EBI here, which obviously stands out. That's the Dairy Economic Breeding Index. So it's breeding cows to be healthier, more efficient, more better at converting feed, lasting longer in the herd, and so on and so forth. There are very few, if any, direct enteric methane mitigation technologies in this, with dietary lipids essentially being the only one that's currently incorporated in the MAC curve. Okay, so what do we need to do, or where do we need to go, and what's the roadmap for delivering on this challenge? Frank Amara, who's the director of Teagasc, and his colleagues recently produced this roadmap. So essentially, we need to get from 23 megatons of carbon dioxide equivalents in the agri-food sector in 2018 down to about 17.25 million tons by 2030. So the first step along the way is the implementation of these technologies we just viewed in the marginal abatement cost curve. That's phase one. That's proposed to deliver 1.5 to 2 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent removals from the industry. Phase two then is focused on the almost ready technologies which weren't contained in the MAC curve. These would include things like feed additives. And feed additives in an Irish context probably have, currently the feed additives available have a wider application because we would house a lot of our animals over the winter months, so there's an opportunity for feeding under controlled circumstances indoors. Fertiliser and changing fertiliser type and reduction in fertiliser usage. And one that's particularly important in an Irish context is the earlier slaughter of our beef animals. And that's modelled and it's quite clear to recognise that earlier slaughter will deliver reduced emissions per head in the beef industry. The phase 3 then those phase 2 technologies are hoped to deliver another 1.5 to 2 megatons. And phase 3 technologies are feed additives at pasture, which there is quite a degree of research underway in the country at the moment, and breeding low-emitting animals. And again, that's a technology that's not unusual to a New Zealand audience. So by 2030, our target is to reach that 17.25 megatons carbon dioxide equivalents from the agri-food sector. So yes, it's possible, but it's very challenging. It's critical now to deliver on phase 1, and that's really very widespread across industry adaptation of those technologies. The evidence to date would suggest that the dairy sector is progressing more rapidly in the adoption of those technologies, and some of the other sectors are lagging somewhat behind. And we need to continue to develop more technologies and also to support farmers in their adoption and in their application at farm level. So last slide there, Chairman, so just don't throw the bell altogether now. There is another project underway to look at the development of on-farm carbon balance sheets. So the European carbon farming proposals says by 2028, access to verified emissions and removal data for all land managers will be available. So a number of the key industry stakeholders and players, predominantly Teagasc, the Irish Cattle Breeding Federation, and Board Bia, are pooling their databases and their data resources to develop an on-farm database with data collected from multiple separate sources. This is particularly focused at the moment on emissions at farm level, but will evolve to include removals, carbon removals at farm level. This will be used to support farmer decision making for the implementation of technologies and to monitor progress over time. So that program is due to be launched essentially any day now, Q1 of 2023. I think a particularly important milestone in the lifetime of that venture is the inclusion of Tier 2 soil emissions factors, and there's a lot of discovery and a lot of investigation underway in that regard at the moment. So that's a very quick summary of where we are in Ireland. Just in recognition of Joran's comments yesterday about carbon footprint, I will say I didn't fly to New Zealand solely for the purpose of this 10-minute presentation. When Harry heard I was going to be in New Zealand, he asked me to speak, and I was delighted to do so. Now, I do recognise the fact that Ireland is very far from New Zealand. I'm so far from home, actually, if I went any further, I'd already be on my way back. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Don. No worries. Thank you, Tommy. That's a very good Irishism. If I went any further, I'd already be on my way back. I'll remember that one.